our conversation on the origins of mystical philosophy. And I thought a fitting place to start would to do a brief recap of where we left off with our conversation. So, in our last conversation, Ryan and I were looking at mystical philosophy and rational inquiry and the relationship between the two. And our conversation was exploring, uh, you know, several fundamental questions such as what is mystical philosophy? How is it distinguished from other types of philosophy? Is mystical philosophy and rational inquiry mutually opposed or not? Is mystical philosophy really a distinct category at all, or is it just an undercurrent that runs through all philosophy and science, whether explicitly acknowledged or not? And in our last conversation, we explored the nature of mystical philosophy and its relationship to rational inquiry. And some things that we uncovered were questions such as what is mystical philosophy? So, one thing we uncovered was that mystical philosophy is a way of life rather than an abstract intellectual pursuit. And it's rooted in direct experience and in intuition rather than strict logical deduction. And it's not about analyzing reality, but about inhabiting it, merging with the truth rather than merely thinking about it. And um, mystical philosophy also embraces paradox and ineffability, where rational philosophy seeks clarity and mystical thought, on the contrary, is comfortable with mystery. We also looked at a fundamental question, which was, is mystical philosophy opposed to rational inquiry? And we challenged the idea that mystical and rational inquiry are fundamentally opposed. Instead, we proposed a continuum rather than a strict dichotomy. And Pythagoras, I think, exemplifies this synthesis. His concept of theoria, which we might simply describe as intellectual vision, blended contemplation of mathematical truths with ecstatic experience. And his music of the spheres is a case in point. The music of the spheres is both a scientific and a mystical insight, and numbers revealed the divine order. We considered whether the fusion still privileges reason over experience, or whether true mystical philosophy requires a more embodied communal dimension. We also looked at the interplay between reason and emotion, and we looked at great thinkers like Einstein and Newton, who integrated reason with mystical intuition. So Einstein's cosmic religious feeling shows how deep rational inquiry often conceals emotional and mystical foundations. Newton was deeply engaged in alchemy and esoteric thought, and he combined formal science with his mystical pursuits. So this led us to ask, is mystical philosophy truly distinct, or is it an undercurrent that runs through all deep inquiry, scientific or otherwise? Finally, we looked at this question, namely, is rationalism and mysticism, is it a false dichotomy? And we looked at how rationalism and mysticism are on a spectrum. So rather than opposing categories, we proposed that they maybe exist on a spectrum of thought. Spinoza, for example, he's a prime candidate because his ethics was a rationalist work written in geometric proofs, yet his vision of the cosmos as a unified and infinite substance, which we could describe in the Latin dues sive natura, was deeply mystical. And perhaps the real difference lies not in rational versus mystical, but in how much each philosopher acknowledges and integrates the mystical dimension. And so, where I would like to point us in, as far as where we're headed, is into an examination of the origins of mystical philosophy itself. Does it arise from historical conditions, um, metaphysical reality, or human psychology? What role does personality play? Why do some open creative thinkers become mystics while others remain strictly rational? Also, why does all of this matter? So, can mystical philosophy offer wisdom in our modern world? So, these are all questions we can ponder, Ryan, in structuring tonight's discussion. And first, I would like to kind of maybe address this fundamental question, Ryan, which is what are the origins of mystical philosophy and why does it matter today? Maybe we'll examine the first half of that question to begin with, and then maybe we can look at its modern day significance as we go along. But as to the question, what are the origins of mystical philosophy? My own thoughts are that the origins are complex. I think that philosophy originates from a multitude of factors and the interplay between these factors. And I don't think any single factor adequately explains the origins. Um, but there are some central ones that I thought we could examine in our discussion. The first is social, the second is metaphysical, and the third is psychological. So, to further kind of refine our inquiry, let me narrow the question down even a bit further. And I'd like to ask, well, first of all, Ryan, I'm just curious to get maybe your take on the more general question before we get into the specifics. So, do you want to offer your own account of the origins before we delve deeper into it?
I think we can move on to the more specific question. I think, it does kind of just come down to a complex interplay of these factors. You can describe it from sort of any angle and you'll get something out of it, but I think it's best kind of understood as like a complex whole. Like all of these things are kind of interplaying off of one another. They're all kind of grounded in each other as well. So I think we'll see that as we move forward in the discussion.
Yeah, I think we're probably both on board with regards to that, that there is an interplay, an interrelationship between different factors. So, on that note, let's continue on. So, the question I want to ask is how do you see the social dimension shaping the emergence of philosophy? Are we talking about the role of religious traditions, communal rituals, or maybe even the emotional energy of collective experience? And why do you think, or what do you think are primary social mechanisms that give rise to mystical thought? If we're both on board with the idea that the origins of mystical philosophy can be partially explained by social factors, um, you know, how do we more specifically address that? Um, I suppose in my own case, I think that um, we can look to certain social factors. I think Cornford's model actually provides a fairly good model for accounting for the social dimensions of the origins of mystical philosophy. And I've mentioned this central concept before, but it's just this concept of collective representation. And I think a lot of the social origins of philosophy might come down to this notion of collective representation. And just to offer a brief definition, collective representation just refers to the shared beliefs and symbols that a community holds in common, which form the foundation of its worldview. And the pioneering sociologist Emil Durkheim, I believe, coined the phrase, and he claimed that collective representations are collective ideas that shape an individual's perceptions and experiences, and they create this common reality. And in early religious societies, collective representations were key, and they focused on sort of the sacred symbols and rituals and beliefs that binded people together and gave them a shared sense of meaning. And one kind of textbook example that I like to think of in kind of illustrating this concept is like a flag, like a national flag or something. And you know, such a thing is what we might call a collective representation. You know, like on the surface, it just seems like a piece of cloth, but um, the shared belief in what the flag represents, things like freedom and unity and identity, unites people under a common understanding. And similarly, in religious societies, shared rituals and symbols like the Pythagorean way of righteousness acted like moral flags, and they guided individuals toward a collective vision of harmony. So it's that core notion, I think, Ryan, that helps to account for the social nature of philosophy and its social origins, especially the mystical tradition. And that understanding suggests that philosophy is not simply just an intellectual exercise. It's not just about thinking, but it's about living, and it's about uh, you know conducting yourself in a certain way, in engaging in certain practices. Um, so, in other words, it's not merely believing in the harmony of the cosmos, for instance, but living in harmony with the cosmos. Um, so and I think all of that is reinforced through social components, like things like rituals. And for Pythagoras in his school, it was things like dietary practices, shared contemplation of numbers, for instance, and you know, silent meditation, and so forth. So that's my initial take on the social factors. There's more that Cornford discusses, and there's more we could discuss. But I feel like just for the sake of focusing our conversation, we could. I personally would just like to direct it into this area, but I'd be curious to hear if you have any alternative takes or any comments or thoughts.
Yeah, I think collective representation is really important here. Like, if you all have a collective, if you all share the same sort of representation of reality or certain components of it, at least, you can at least, you know, identify with one another, be part of the same sort of in group versus out group. Um, but that collective representation, I think what you were saying is what forms the foundation for certain rituals, customs, and things that you all do together.
Hmm.
Making it sort of like you said, sort of a lived community thing, not just sort of a rational process or a rational engagement and isolated thought.
Yeah, no, I think you got a point there.
This is
I
where
think
we were talking about nomos, I think, before, like transitioning from that myth to like sort of metaphysical to the social, which was like nomos, sort of laws or customs of
yeah,
the group.
yeah. Well, I think that's part of Cornford's analytical framework, but I think all of those factors he identifies intertwine. So I mean, I think nomos, as it is understood, um, you know, just as a concept, is kind of this idea of societal laws, that bind a society together. So they could be certain like legal rules or prescriptions. What is permitted within the law, what's not permitted within the law. For example, um, theft and violence and things like that are generally prohibited by law. Um, but it's not simply like societal law um, in some ways. Like I know maybe for the case with some philosophers, nomos just corresponds to societal laws, like human-made laws. But I know with Pythagoras and his philosophical school, nomos and the laws weren't simply just societal, but they were like cosmic, and they
Mm-hmm.
generalized to like the entire cosmos. So they were laws by which one could understand the way that reality works and operates, and so um, for example, um, that there is a kind of a harmony to the universe that human beings are sort of, I guess the challenge for human beings is to align oneself with that harmony, and there's this moral harmony, and um, Pythagoras really emphasized that transgression of that harmony led to a de-evolution, um, and kind of it was tied to his notion of reincarnation. So the way we conduct our lives, in our daily lives, will impact how it is we'll be reborn into the next life. And if we're cruel to other human beings and if we're cruel to animals, then that's going to leave a um, leave an imprint on our history, and it will lead to a future manifestation in which are born perhaps as a you know uh, well, maybe in an undesired form or manifestation, like we might be born as an earthworm or something, um, because of the moral transgressions we committed in our lifetime. Maybe we were cruel to others or to animals or something. Um, so this kind of ties more into this is kind of where the social meets metaphysical. Um, but in any case, what I'm trying to get at with all of this, as much of a tangent and a digression, is how this links up with the collective representation. So this is all part of a collective representation of the world, and it's shaped through the social factors, through um, the transmission of these ideas from members of the group, and through reinforced through things like rituals, through abstaining for, like in Pythagoras' case, it was abstaining from eating meat. They were kind of a vegetarian philosophical school. And they did things like um, contemplated numbers. They engaged in silent meditation. They were prohibited from eating beans too. That was another taboo because they thought beans embodied like the life essence. So, and all of these things had kind of like repercussions. If you were to overstep these moral boundaries, then these would have repercussions for you in future manifestations. So it's almost kind of like if you're familiar with Eastern philosophy, it's almost like karma in a way.
Yeah, it sounds very, very similar to karma, and it's oddly scientific though, like in the way that he like everything has an effect, like you know what I mean? It's very cause and effect. It's very like mindful of like your actions have consequences, which I find very intriguing for that time period because like Pythagoras was what 400 or 500 BC. I find that so fascinating that they're thinking that deeply back then.
Yeah,
It's so far beyond me.
yeah. Well, I think it also ties into this is kind of getting into Pythagoras' morality, his mystical morality.
Hmm.
But at the core, at one of the core um, um, ethical principles within his morality is this notion of justice, and it's not like just kind of justice within human affairs, but it's like justice on the cosmic scale.
Mm.
And just as we have nomos, um, which is not merely a societal laws, but they're cosmic laws. In the same way, justice is kind of like a cosmic law. So maybe it's how nomos manifests itself on the cosmic scale. Like there is a moral order to the cosmos, and that overstepping certain boundaries, like killing animals, causing like malicious cruelty to your fellow human beings, and things of this nature, are violating this cosmic principle of justice. And as a consequence, there are repercussions of that, which are, um, I suppose, the punishment is, you know, you manifest as an undesired life form, or you regress to an existence which is a step backward rather than forward in sort of in the perpetual death rebirth cycle that all beings go through. Um, so, and again, that's
Sounds
part of
very similar to
collect.
Christianity too, in that sense of like, it sounds like very almost like proto-Christian, worrying about like what's going to happen to you in the afterlife, if you do X, Y, and Z or transgress like God's will, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're kind of similar concepts, and I know that Pythagoras and a lot of the ancient Greek philosophy went on to influence early Christianity,
Hmm.
especially like Neoplatonism, um, which was in the early beginnings of Christianity. I think Aristotelianism became more of an influence later on with like Thomas Aquinas. Um, but all of these are kind of share similar core ethical notions and so on and so forth. But in any case, yeah, that's just we're just talking about the social aspects of the origins, and these are some of them. And I think this idea of collective representation sheds light on sort of these social origins. We have we have shared beliefs about reality and how it works, and these beliefs are learned in our social environments and transmitted socially through teachers, through rituals, through kind of the institutions of the world we live in, and so that's I think provides one core foundation for the origins of mystical philosophy. Not so unless you have any other thoughts, Ryan, I thought we could move forward, perhaps.
Yeah. Just could you maybe give people listening an idea of what would be an example of like a collective representation, like a specific example for people maybe to grasp onto or understand like what we're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, in the case of Pythagoras, you know, their collective representations can be um, found in many different facets of his philosophy. So let's turn to maybe, let me think here. Let's turn to reincarnation because we've been talking about it. But I know with Pythagoras, um, the notion of collective representation is kind of um, manifested in the notion of reincarnation, which kind of functions as this central unifying doctrine, and it symbolizes the continuity of life and the soul's journey through an interconnected cosmic cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And so, sort of, that's the representation, and um, the representation, in other words, is this shared belief in reincarnation. And it's not merely like an abstract idea, Ryan. It's embodied in the specific rituals and symbols that reinforced communal bonds and moral purpose. So, for example, vegetarianism is one case in point. So the Pythagoreans they adhered to strict ethical practices with regards to things like vegetarianism and abstaining from eating animals. And this was based on their belief that all living beings housed souls at various stages of their purification. So this practice was deeply rooted in the doctrine of reincarnation, and it was both a symbolic and a practical way of honoring the interconnectedness of life. So that's one example to make it a bit more concrete. But it's the shared belief in reincarnation, along with the rituals and symbols that reinforced sort of the social cohesion and moral purpose of the group. And so vegetarianism was one such ritual practice based upon those beliefs. There's others as well I could go into, but that's one sort of you know um, fairly evident one.
So yeah, so the collective representation of reincarnation, manifested as certain communal practices, like vegetarianism or whatever, right? That seems to be it seems to make sense, right? One logically follows from the other.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. Like there's
cool.
an interplay between their beliefs and their the practical way of life.
Hmm.
So that's showing how this shared belief, this collective representation, goes on to influence one's conduct, one's way of life, and that's kind of getting at the heart of mystical philosophy, because mystical philosophy is not merely abstract contemplation, but it's also a way of being. Um, so yeah, that's that kind of just to answer your question. Um, so unless you have any other questions, I thought we could shift to the next set of questions that I had, and these are questions focused on exploring some of the tensions and some of the divergences, that arise within this conversation. And so I'd like to kind of like look into some of the concepts and themes of the origins of mystical philosophy, and sort of how the interplay between these ideas we're discussing creates, uh, you know, creates some tension. And some tensions we can explore are things like the tensions between historical and sociological factors, say, versus metaphysical and psychological factors. And so maybe I can just begin with posing some questions we could pursue in this regard. Um, Also, how are we doing for time? By the way, we're about 25 minutes in. Um, how much longer would you want to go?
We could about do another 15, 20.
Another 15? Okay, that sounds good. I think that'll get us through this next chunk of our discussion here. So, questions I want to ask are, and I want to push back a little bit, but if mystical philosophy arises from collective representation, then does that mean it is entirely a social construct? In other words, is mystical philosophy just something that emerges from human societies as a means of organizing um, ourselves, or do you think there's something more to it, something that transcends the social framework? So, if we take Cornford's position too strictly, we might end up saying that mystical philosophy is just an outgrowth of social organization rather than a response to real metaphysical truths. So, do you think collective representation explains mystical philosophy, or is it just the vessel through which something deeper is expressed? And so, I'll offer my own take, and I'd be curious to what your thoughts are, Ryan. But as far as my own take goes, I think that Cornford's sociological framework is partially correct. I think that it's also insufficient because it overlooks the ontological and the existential dimensions of mystical thought. And I think if we treat mystical philosophy as a byproduct of collective rituals and social structures, then we risk ignoring what might be called its deeper function, which is an intrinsic inquiry into the nature of being itself. So, looking back at Pythagoras as our textbook example here, his system wasn't just a social framework; it was a response to a real structure in the universe, one that he believed was embedded in numbers, harmony, and cosmic order. So, the music of the spheres, for instance, isn't just a metaphor. It's an ontological claim about the fundamental nature of reality. And Pythagoras wasn't just describing a cultural belief in this regard, he was articulating something that he thought was objectively real, something that existed whether or not human societies recognized it. So that's kind of the one of the central criticisms of Cornford's approach, his overemphasis on the social dimension and maybe his overlooking of the metaphysical and existential dimension. But I'm just curious to get your take on that, Ryan. Do you think that's kind of like a valid critique?
Yeah, I think we can risk sort of losing the metaphysical and the sort of existential elements of like what it means to be a philosopher or a mystical philosopher, and sort of what motivates someone into doing that. Um, and I think that there is something that we're aiming towards when we're having these collective representations, right? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
are these collective representations of, right?
Yeah.
What are we representing? Um, and it seems like a lot of these things that we're representing were all representing, throughout history, right? It's a repeat, through history, different cultures. We're all trying to
Yeah.
represent the same sorts of things, perhaps slightly differently in our own ways. You can see the parallels, like, you just read any religious texts. You can see a lot of the parallelisms and the same problems they're
Right.
trying to tackle. So
Right.
um, I think that does bring into question, like, what is that? And I think that is the sort of that metaphysical and that sort of deep existential drive we have in into understanding that.
Right.
Um, but I do think we get at that through the social, through the relationships that we have with one another. And I think a lot of those deep metaphysical questions are revealed to us in our deep relationships that we have, those
Hmm.
committed relationships to one another, to people that we love. Those are where we find like true answers about life and meaning. And I don't think that's a coincidence, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think that the social is like laid on top of the metaphysical. And if you're as a Christian, I know things get difficult when I'm not following, the Bible, or I'm not being biblical with my relationships.
Hmm.
It's like I'm not following metaphysical truth that is revealed to me in the word of the Bible.
Hmm.
And so I want to organize myself in accordance with that, as much as possible.
Right.
And some of those things are revealed to me just in the way that I go about my day. When I go to church, those things are like, whoa, okay, I see why that's important, or I never thought about that.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I really do think you can lose it and just think that it's all social and it's just kind of nothing but a construct, if
Hmm.
you're not taking the metaphysical seriously, because what are we trying to represent if it's
Right.
not something metaphysical, right?
Right. Yeah, I know. It seems like there's an apparent contradiction, on the one hand, there is this social dimension which seems to influence the development of our ideas, our collective representations. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem like our collective representations are reducible to that social dimension. That we have an inherent or innate tendency to, um, wonder about the nature of things, wonder about the nature of reality. What is reality? How does it work? What processes are involved? What is truth? How do I live authentically and um, ethically? And all of these questions are questions motivated by this inquiry into the nature of the universe itself, not necessarily the byproducts of social influences, although they can be they can be constrained by social influences. I don't think our metaphysical inquiries operate in a vacuum. They operate, I think, in a social world. And I think part of what you were saying there pointed toward that interplay again. And you mentioned kind of how your religious community you're a part of, how your interactions with fellow members of that community have kind of shaped your own moral views and beliefs, your collective representations. And I think that speaks to what Cornford calls herd suggestion. So, like on the one hand, we have our collective representation, which is our shared beliefs, our shared ethical notions, for example. If you're Christian, for example, generally you think that killing is bad and you want to avoid killing. And this is true of various other religions and ethical philosophies and mystical traditions. That's just a kind of a plain example that I bring up. But um, the way that belief that killing is bad is socially transmitted is what through what Cornford calls herd suggestion, and that's just the powerful influence of communal beliefs and behaviors on individuals within the group. And um, you know, they're often beliefs reinforced through the collective atmosphere, and certain spiritual practices. So just to take kind of like a generic example, so imagine being at a concert and the entire crowd is swaying to the music, and this is kind of creating this shared emotional experience. So even if you didn't start out feeling connected, the collective energy pulls you in, and it shapes how you feel and behave. And Pythagorean rituals or any other religious rituals worked in a similar way. I know, like in the case of Pythagoras, using group ceremonies helped to reinforce moral ideals like self purification and harmony. So, um, yeah, it's like that collective energy you get by being in part of a group. And it's the same kind of energy you get, when you're at a concert as well. Like whenever you're in certain situations, where there are these shared collective beliefs and these ritual practices, it seems like this is like the fertile ground in which these collective representations are, you know, imprinted and reinforced, and ultimately then go on to be enacted in your own behavior. Um, you know, I think like sports is another analogy as well you could think of.
Sorry, the connection between the social and the metaphysical I find interesting, precisely because like we are social beings, and I feel as if you think of a human being in complete isolation, they're doomed, right? Like in actual complete isolation with no record of um, you know of what to do in life, like from being taught and passed things down. Like we're pretty helpless in nature. And I think again the social is some way, just almost without even consciously doing it, represents something metaphysical, some sort of metaphysical truth about reality, like the relationships, the very basic relationships that we have with human beings, the most fundamental ones, I think come laden with metaphysical truths. And probably get into some Levinas or some other philosophers at some point and talk about that. But
Right. Yeah, no, I'd be happy to go down those rabbit holes. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I share in your assessment that, um, you know, our our social world and our relationships that form the basis of our social world is itself part of the fabric of reality. It's part of that metaphysical fabric, and um, our social relationships and the social world we operate in says something I think maybe deep about the nature of reality itself, um, and that's something we could probe more deeply. Um, I think that in and of itself is a pretty profound question. But I think that you know the way, like, language is, I think, a good example. Language is generally something that's socially transmitted, yet it allows us to grasp a world beyond language that is maybe independent of language, but is something we can access through language. Like mathematics, for example, is a prime example. Mathematics, um, you know, explains, I think, the nature of reality on a deep level. Yet the language we use um, within mathematics is, you know, rooted in social um, customs and institutions and shared meanings between people, collective representations, in other words. We all know that 1 + 1 = 2 because, um, you know, on the basis of logic and on the basis of, you know, um, the meaning that that proposition has within a particular community, within a particular society as well, too. Right. So, um, yeah, these are deep questions for us to probe, Brian. I don't know if I can get to the bottom of it in the time that we have left, and I know our time is increasingly fleeting here. So maybe this might just be a good time to wrap things up. We haven't gotten to the end yet, but we can pick up the thread where we left off last time. Um, so maybe I'll just briefly close things out. So far we've talked about the social origins of philosophy and this tension between the social origins and also these existential and metaphysical considerations from which philosophy might also arise. Um, Perhaps this tendency to inquire into the nature of reality is something that is partly not shaped from social institutions. Maybe it goes deeper than that. Maybe it's rooted in our human nature and our psychology and our desire to know. I think we'll um, head down this territory as we go forward into this conversation. But in any case, this is kind of the territory we've covered so far. And I think so far the key takeaway, like if we're kind of trying to look at to synthesize these tensions, Ryan, I think that there is a synthesis between these social influences and these metaphysical and existential aspects as well, which when put together can give us a more comprehensive understanding of the origins of mystical philosophy. And so I think a key takeaway is just that the origins of philosophy are multifaceted, and there is a interplay between social factors and metaphysical factors, and probably other factors which we'll go on to explore as we delve deeper into this conversation. So, anyways, do you have any closing thoughts or any last words you wanted to get in before we sign off?
I think next time we should start off maybe hitting home a bit more why we think this is like relevant or like important. Like what was the like why does this all matter today? Maybe like I want us to think about that a bit more. Like what is the relevance of all of this sort of ancient mystical philosophical tradition? Like what could we apply it to, and how could we use it in our understanding of maybe what's going on in the world?
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's the question of why is this important? Why is this significant? And maybe that's one of the primary questions. Maybe just at a first pass, I think mystical traditions provide us with insights into a way of life and an ethical orientation, um, a way of knowing. So we can delve more deeply into that as we progress. But I think it's important that we, you know, touch base with the practical significance of this, because it is layered with practical significance for sure. So yeah. So in any case, that's all I really have to say. And on that note, I think that maybe I'll just leave the audience with a final remark. Philosophy isn't about arriving at final answers. It's about refining the way we ask questions. So I'll leave you with this. If mystical philosophy bridges the gap between human experience and cosmic reality, how should we engage with it in our lives? So that just kind of speaks to your question, Ryan, but I just want everyone to sit with that, to explore it. And, as always, stay curious, stay open, and keep the Dialogos alive. So talk to you later, and we'll pick up where we left off.